This is a Flying Cow production.
Well, hello and welcome back to Must Watch Movies, the podcast where we talk about films that the other has suggested for the other and occasional phantom shitters. I am, of course, your host, the Flying Cow himself, Clay Johnson, and here with me is my co-host, Jack Allison. How you doing today, Jack?
I'm okay. This is horrible timing. I have to burp really bad for the fried chicken I just ate, and it can't come out. So.
Yeah, yes. If you missed our intro episode, Jack was eating chicken.
I'm still eating
that,
chicken like weeks later.
Yes,
the same chicken, just weeks later.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That actually might be why you have heartburn, Jack.
No, it's not heartburn. Like, I just have this big ball of gas that just decided to say hi in my stomach, and I can't get it out.
Oh, I love that.
What's worse, like
just eating like a heavy meal? Yeah.
What's worse to you? Like, I guess rank them. Like a burp you can't get out, a fart you can't get out, or a yawn you can't get
out. Shit on the walls.
Shit you can't get out is a bad time.
Yeah.
But I guess a shit you can get out on the wall is
even worse.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. But yeah, no, I hate anything that has to do with stomach pain. Like honestly, you could put a nail through my hand and I would get through it better than a stomach pains. I'm a baby when it comes to stomach issues.
I get it. This is bad. I can't get it. I keep trying to like quietly do it. So if it comes out on the podcast, I'm sorry. I'm going to try to like step away or something. Probably.
Yeah, no, it's all right.
All right. So yeah, we're here to talk about a movie today, everybody. A movie that one of us has seen and the other one hasn't.
That's right. We are talking about 1950s Rashomon, directed by Akira Kurosawa, and let's see, starring Toshiro Mifune, Machiko Kayu, Masayuki Mori, and Takashi Shimura.
Yeah.
I can pronounce these names. It just sometimes takes me a second to get my brain around them. But yeah. So I mean, yeah, I here it is. You introduced this film to me, and I'm the one that has to introduce it.
Hey, you started it.
I know. I could have just said, "Hey, Jack, introduce this film that I haven't seen." But I will say, Rashomon is a film that even if you haven't seen it, you know the concept of it,
or you think you do.
I mean, right? Exactly. I mean, that's definitely something we're going to talk about. Is that a lot of films? This is one of those kind of foundational films that whose plot, at least the broad strokes of it, have been reused in so many films, television, lots of different things. But definitely in this case, there are a lot of things that only Rashomon does that other copycats don't really bring along.
And misinterpret. Funny enough, ironically.
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of the copycats really just represent it as three different perspectives, and then usually like the last outside perspective, they're like, oh yeah, that's what really happened, or something like that. Whereas with this, Rashomon is actually a lot deeper than that, because it is definitely the three different perspectives. That's what everybody takes away from it. But the thing that I find really interesting about this film, and I'm just, we're just going to dissect to me what is the crux of this film, is that they basically end up deciding, at least one character does at the end, that they're all wrong and that everyone is shit, basically. Because, you know, they all have different views on this same situation that happened. But what I find interesting is that, you know, I mean, I don't really want to get into that until we break down more of the characters and stuff. But you know, you introduced this film to me, Jack. What are your thoughts on the film,
I mean,
in general?
yeah, I mean, it's a lot. We'll get into it further, I guess, as we go. Yeah, I kind of piggyback off of what you were saying with like its cultural impact. It's obviously been huge. Like the fact that this movie is called Rashomon, and it wasn't based on like a story called Rashomon. It's based on a short story called I think in the Grove. And
Yeah.
but now whenever you have something told like this, where it's like different perspective, contradictory storytelling, it's called a Rashomon type of story. That's how much of a landmark this was.
Right.
To your point earlier, something that is oftentimes done, like you'll see like a lot of bottle episodes on television. I think the first I ever saw there was like this was like a King of the Hill episode when I was younger. That was a Rashomon story regarding like the fire department or something. I think it was where they utilized that. But again, something that I've seen while I've seen plenty of films and TV shows attempt this sort of thing. I think what Rashomon does that all of them miss out on is, well, I guess two things. It's for one, I think that this film in and of itself is like one of the most like similar to 12 Angry Men, like one of the most complex, simple stories in film, hands down.
Yeah.
Because it's a simple narrative. Like you can take it and go, and that's it. But if you like actually kind of like look at like the effect it has, the knock-on effect throughout the story with the characters that are telling the story, and the knock-on effect of the characters within the story, looking at perspectives,
Right.
you can glean so much of their character just from how they tell the story, rather than like what their actions or statements in the narrative actually are.
Right.
And I think what I was getting to earlier, what I think another thing is that many TV shows and films that take the inspiration and miss out on is the effect it has on the characters telling the story. I think that's something that this film does that you just don't really see with like a bottle episode like King of the Hill. It's just 3 or 4 different stories, and they don't always line up. And then there's like an overarching narrative that just kind of stays concrete in spite of that. Whereas with this, you have the characters' perspectives changing. You have them changing their narrative. That you have them changing their ideologies to some degree based on their recounting of the stories and the events that happen to their own lives outside of the story, and how that affects how they respond to that. There's so much going on with this film, but again, you can look at it as the simplest sort of narrative that again just has it's just like it's a huge iceberg, and there's so much beneath the surface that's just fun to explore. And again, this is I think if I had to guess, at least 10th time watching this film, and I feel like I get something out of it every single time I see it. Yeah, I'm a big Kurosawa fan. And this was one of the ones I had to see early on. And again, years and years and years later, I still love so much of the film, and I feel like I appreciate a lot more of it having just recently rewatched it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know, you talk about other things that have done this. I think the first one that I saw that did a play on Rashomon was an episode of Tiny Toons.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when I found out, like, I think the first few that I saw that did this were more comedic. So when I saw, or when I heard about the actual film and realized the subject matter of it, I was like, oh, okay, interesting, because Rashomon is basically a story about, from 3 different perspectives, well, ultimately 4, from different perspectives about a murder, but also the aftermath of a rape. And honestly, another thing that I find interesting is that a few of the other versions of this type of story that I have seen do deal with, you know, some sort of he said, she said sort of narrative around, maybe not a rape, but some sort of sexual.
Honestly, Last Duel is a great example if you
Yeah.
ever saw that film.
I haven't seen that yet, but I've heard I've heard enough about it it sounds basically kind of an updated version of this type of thing. But the one I'm thinking of is there's an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation that basically the episode is about it is about a death, but there's also
Rape?
there's accusations of a harassment, sexual harassment.
Okay.
And from one character, he thought she was completely coming on to him, and she saw it, or at least claims that it was unwanted advances from him. And then from the husband's perspective, he thought she was cheating on him and that they were in it together. So it's very interesting. But then there's also, have you ever seen the film Eve's Bayou?
I think so.
Now it's a little different because it's really just two perspectives. But it's a similar thing where there are accusations of harassment between a father and a daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And at least based on the perspective, each one thinks that the other one initiated something.
Yeah.
At least that's the story that's told.
Yeah.
And it's left very ambiguous. Really interesting. But with this one, what I find interesting, and just to kind of give the basic overview of this story, it is bookended by two characters, a woodcutter and a priest, that are basically taking shelter during a rainstorm, and they are talking about this court trial that has just happened, and they are talking to just another common person from the town, and they are giving their stories of basically relating to him everything that happened. And so basically he's getting third-hand stories, all of these stories were from different people's perspectives, but even the telling of their stories is actually coming through the woodcutter and the priest. So who's to know how factual they were in retelling those accounts? But they are accounting the story of a samurai, his wife, and a bandit. And the majority of the story is told first by the bandit. And what I find interesting is that the first half of the bandit story is never called into question. It's never, honestly, a good majority of it is his own perspective before he even encounters them. So there's not much that they can, but everything is never questioned until after the assault. It's only after the assault that these three characters disagree as to what happened, and it is wildly different. But the three, obviously, the most interesting version of all is the samurai story, because he's dead, so it's actually being told through a medium that is channeling him.
Theoretically.
Yes, exactly.
Because I think it adds another layer to call into question their sincerity in doing so, or if they actually are communicating on behalf of the dead.
Right. But it's very interesting because What I find most interesting about it is that you would assume, and I think most versions of that have taken this type of storytelling device have basically each character that tells their story tells a very self-serving version of the story. And from a certain perspective, each one of them are serving us themselves from a certain point of view, but in none of them do any of them look great. I mean, the bandit story, he straight up admits that he raped this woman and then killed this man, but he did it in the most macho, dominant way possible. And the woman, she obviously doesn't contest being assaulted, and obviously she's not going to. It's what happened. But where her story differs is basically in the way she conducted herself afterwards, because according to him, she was ready to run away with him and all of this kind of stuff. But the version that she tells is basically just completely supplicating, trying to, mend fences with her husband, and her husband just didn't want to have anything to do with her afterwards. And I mean, honestly, if you pay attention to her version, it almost sounds like she killed her husband, but blacked out and doesn't remember.
Yeah.
And then, right. And then the samurai's version is that basically after it happened, he was just so disgusted with his wife that he killed himself.
Yeah. You can extrapolate a lot about their values, looking at the way they tell the stories about like what's important to them. And I think that's
right.
The overarching thing with the story that you have to consider, like, why like deciphering the lies is obviously like not supposed to be too clear, because again, or rather deciphering the truth is not supposed to be too clear, but by extension, the lies. I think the common ground though is that the samurai is someone speaking on behalf of from a perspective of the chivalric code, I guess, to a chivalric code, I should say.
I was about to say, I think a lot of this is so cultural that we don't necessarily, get it. I mean, I would say even Japanese culture wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of the current Japanese culture, wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of the stances being taken here, but it was kind of what was kind of tradition and accepted during this time.
It's very societal, like sort of driven, like I said, like with his wife, her driving motive throughout, at least from her storytelling, is to make herself look as honorable as possible in spite of the objective truth of her being assaulted. And with the bandit, it's clear like he's more so like wants to come off with the most bravado and the most like reputation as possible. So when you kind of examine it through those stories, it is easy to pick up what are the most tenuous parts of their storylines. But again, when those all three come into play so much so that you can't, the tenuous elements of their storyline are all intersecting and crossing one another to the point where you can't like say like, okay, well, he says the dagger was here. Well, okay, this person said he was killed with a sword. It's that sort of thing. Like you can't, there's not enough there for you to be able to piece together like which one is more likely than the other, because again, they're all based on some type of bias. And you can even throw that towards the people that are either telling the story on behalf of the other people, or again, well, like the medium, for example. Like if I was like a medium and I'm full of shit, I'm probably going to be looking at, hey, this is a samurai. His ideal is honor. His ideal is to make myself look not proud or arrogant, but also, if my wife is betraying me and running away, maybe that you can see like how a medium who may be not truthful could be interpreting the story the way that they did, knowing that it's a samurai telling it.
Whether it's the medium or the actual samurai, it's interesting that he basically says that at a certain point he forgave the bandit. He's pissed at his wife, and I'm just like, that's messed up.
Well, I think again, I'm not I'm not necessarily saying like that's right or wrong. I think from the perspective it wants that character would want us to take from that is that they look at the idea of betrayal as a greater
Right.
sin than the lifestyle of a thief, which was pretty blatant to them in the first place. You know, thieves are
Right.
everywhere, but like being betrayed by your wife, your life partner, is a greater, I would imagine, sin to commit in that, especially in that time.
Well, and I was about to say, a lot of this has to do with the time in which that it was
Subservience.
portrayed,
Yeah.
because obviously this is from a historical perspective, even from when it was made. Obviously this is 1950. This is not the stuff that was happening, not the code that was being followed in the 1950s, but there's still a very interesting look at the way that women are viewed in this society. And I think that it was even probably a commentary on where women were in society at the time, in 1950, not necessarily even just in the period in which this is set, which, I mean, would this be not feudal Japan necessarily? It says
I know a lot of
the
his movies are based on the
Heian
time period. So
era,
okay,
which
okay.
was okay. Oh, okay, so yeah, it might have been feudal. It was 794 to 1185. That era of Japan is when this is set.
Okay.
So
I
yeah,
mean,
definitely in the past, but it's just very interesting that, like I said, in a lot of this, it's shame towards her, like him assaulting her was her fault, which is messed up.
yeah, and out of the 4 iterations that are told to us throughout the story, I feel like the last one is the one where you can argue she comes to anything close to being the strongest of the trinamic in that
Right.
story. And again, that's
But it's still kind of like, I will say, I think you're right. It definitely gives her the most power and the most strength, but it also slightly demonizes her a little bit.
well, I think that's also intentional based on the person telling the story as well. The idea of
Right.
like these 3 characters who are like there are 3 narrators throughout the story. The characters being under the reigning Rashomon.
Right.
They're all the idea of the of humanity and what is a humanity, and like is humanity inherently good? Is it inherently evil? Is there
Right.
nothing of the sort between any of them? Like I think that's a question that's kind of tossed around throughout their the idea of the human condition is examined
Right.
throughout their telling of the stories. And I think with that woodcutter character to have kind of come to the realization that they do, and having told their own direct recounting of the story that contradicts even their own telling of the story earlier in the film,
Right.
it does put into perspective a lot of, all right, well, how has this experience of retelling the stories shaped
Mhm.
your storytelling?
Right.
And I think that's where I think the idea of like them losing faith in humanity is exemplified the most in that story. Because yes, while she is arguably the strongest that she is presented, the all 3 of them, she's more callous and evil compared to her other
Mhm.
presentations. The other 2 are
Right.
cowardly and inept. Like you even look at their fight
Ugh,
choreography, and it's just so weak and clumsy.
it's great. That's one of the things that I really enjoy about the woodcutters version of the story, is that both of these male figures, who in both of their retellings basically are as noble as they can be in the situation that
Very
they're
stoic,
in.
yeah.
In the woodcutters version, when they are um basically, the wife, they both kind of abandon her,
Mhm.
and she basically takes the only power that she has and says, no, you guys are both abandoning me. No, you guys are both shit. You need to fight. You need to both fight for me. And basically, uh, you know, abuses them into both fighting for her, and they are cowardly and terrified, and neither one of them know how to fight, which
Yeah,
is
it's a
hilarious.
especially compared to the juxtaposed to like the first fight scene where it is like a lot more from the Bandit's perspective, it's a lot more stylistic and a lot more.
Yes, he was the better fighter, but they both knew how to fight. They were both good fighters. It was a good fight. And then you see the woodcutters version, and they're shit.
Yeah, yeah.
It's great.
Yeah.
But
I was to say, to your point, I don't know if you had I don't know if that was your personal favor of the stories, the retelling. Obviously, like, again, it's hard to, you can't really say that I believe this one over the other ones,
right.
But I think for me, my favorite
there's a lot about that one that I do like, because it seems the most likely of all of them. I do think, the whole we get that story at the end, because basically he had originally told a version of the story where he just found the dead samurai, and that he reported it, and that's why all of this trial is happening. And he keeps claiming that, oh, I just didn't want to get involved, I didn't want to, get pulled into all this trouble. But he eventually comes out with more of the story, and there is, as you mentioned, the question of the wife's dagger. It's brought up. I think the first time it's really brought up where it is in the bandit's story. Because, well, it's brought up in the bandit story because he's like, what happened to her dagger? Oh, I must have left it. That was stupid of me. It was really valuable. Why did I do that?
Yeah. And his reaction to it's especially noteworthy, because it's like they bring out the dagger, and like he has a face where it says, oh, either I really did forget about it, or oh shit, I forgot that detail in my self-aggrandized story.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And like I said, that character is played by Toshiro Mifune. And I mean, Toshiro Mifune is a name that you will hear if you dive into Akira Kurosawa at all, because I think he was in the majority, if not all, of his films.
Same with Shimura. They were both in a lot of their stuff. And I think both those actors, without saying too much, I guess, but like I think both those actors are just, it's kind of perfect that he got both those actors to collaborate with so many times as he did, because they're not only phenomenal, both respectively, but they are also so contrasting when it comes to their acting approach. Like,
it's true. Honestly, I'm really glad that you said that, because I was like, obviously I think the Bandit, Toshiro Mifune is a phenomenal actor. Everybody that has heard the name hears that how good of an actor he is. But I wasn't as familiar with Shimura, and without even knowing who he was, I just picked out the Bandit and the Woodcutter are the most interesting people to watch in this movie.
And the more you watch Akira Kurosawa's work, I guarantee you're gonna come to appreciate both of them, but especially Shimura throughout that, because he does some amazing work that makes me wish he was more as popular, if not more popular than Mifune. Now, I love both of them. I was reading, I think with both of them acting approach wise, like Mifune is the kind of the actor that like cannot keep their, he plays characters that cannot keep their emotions back. If they have something, it's going to physically manifest in their face and body movements and mannerisms in such like a delightful, like, I don't even want to say like scene chewy, but like in just a mesmerizing way. Whereas Shimura, on the flip side, he internalizes so much, but he can keep so much emotion coming through and just like a static face. And there's so many shots from this movie and plenty others of Kurosawa's where it's just a close up on his face, and he's just sitting there pondering and contemplating. But you can see the wheels turning in his head despite the stillness of how he's acting. Such different approaches are phenomenal. Funnily enough, I read Kurosawa's autobiography years ago. There's another also great book if you're interested in their dynamic called The Emperor and the Wolf. But Kurosawa's autobiography, he talks about how there was like an acting competition of some kind, and that's how he found Mifune. Mifune didn't end up winning, but Kurosawa just ended up coming in on a whim that day and just saw this guy going absolutely batshit crazy with like rage and emotion in his audition. Yeah. It was almost animalistic, and like that resonated with him so much that he brought him on to his films and again made him a household name. Like he's incredible. And honestly, I think Mifune probably is his story, mostly because of his performance, but also just the way it's shot is probably my favorite story that's told in this, the first one. the bandit's
Sure.
perspective.
Well, I mean, he play. What I find so interesting is that he plays like a mania with that character. He's constantly laughing through his, and he's admitting to some horrible things,
But it
but he
builds
is,
too.
yeah,
Because when you first see him, he's tied up with his arms behind his back. He's just kind of like staring off, looking into the sky. And then finally, like once the guy next to him like says something that kind of like sparks his interest, he just jumps in. No, here's what happened. You know that.
Yeah.
It's like the monkey's out of the bottle, to quote Pineapple Express. It's very just like boom, suddenly it's there.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I find that performance so interesting when you then contrast it with the woodcutter's version of him, because he likes to portray himself as so powerful and, you know, just ahead of everyone, and really he's impotent.
Yeah, you even see his like hand like shaking like while he's like holding the sword to the guy.
I love that, because they both do it, both he and the guy who plays the samurai. But I love when they show Mifune holding that sword and just like trembling. You can tell how terrified this guy is to fight, because he's a samurai.
Yeah.
How that guy got to be a samurai fighting the way he does, though,
But
don't know.
it's also noteworthy too that like if you look at his face during that scene, like where he has him at sword point and his hand shaking, like if you look at Mifune's face, it's still like it looks ultimately controlled. It looks like fierce and like snarling and almost like fearful. So in a way, you could even like look at that as being some semblance of the truth, because if you look at it from the samurai's recollection, you know, you could be like, oh shit, I'm against like this great threat of an opponent. It isn't just my chivalric pride talking here. Like, because he's looking at him in the face, he's looking at his eyes, he's not seeing his body working in contrast to is the emotion he's trying to express. So there's so much there that's really fun to pick apart.
Yeah. But you know, like we said, you know, the woodcutter eventually tells this story, but when he's done, and you know, all throughout this, as they've been recounting each one of the stories, the woodcutter would basically call bullshit on each one of their stories. He's like, nope, that's not what happened. And eventually them being like, well, how do you know? Were you there? It sounds like you were there. That's when they get the story out of him. And when he's done, basically the commoner calls bullshit on his story. And, you know, that's when he basically brings up, he was like, you know, you okay?
I got it.
Lovely.
Sorry about that. Continue.
It's okay. Sorry about that, folks. I don't have editing to get that out, so I hope you guys enjoyed that. But you know, basically he's like, you know, regardless, you know, he's not really even worried about the perspectives of, you know, how factual the rest of the story is. He's like, you stole that dagger, didn't you? That's why you didn't want to testify. That's why you didn't come forward with anything, why you claimed that you weren't there, because you took the dagger. And he never admits to it verbally, but you can tell that's exactly what happened. Yeah. I mean, because right after that is when they hear crying baby. The commoner steals, you know, a kimono and an amulet wrapped around the baby. You know, I find it interesting. What are your thoughts on the character of the priest? Because to me, the priest is really only there to kind of talk about the morality or amorality of everyone else.
I think it is. I if I had to pick, I think honestly, this is maybe super metatextual. I don't know. I think the priest is a lot of ways the closest we get to an audience type of surrogate in the way the film
agreed.
sees its characters.
Because at the end, he's the one that is, you know, basically puts together that basically the whole film. Well, the commoner, throws it out bluntly, but it's the priest that mourns about it, basically, that, all of these stories are corrupt in one way or another. They're all, meant to make each other look better or hide something. They're all selfish. And
it challenges us to watch the film through and hear the stories through a moral lens, which is what he is.
Yeah. But, it basically, like I said, something that none of the other versions I've ever seen do is that really the idea is not which one of these perspectives is right, is that they're all tilted, they're all slanted, they're all selfish. We're doomed. Basically, humanity is horrible. And like we said, the priest is, at before all of it is revealed, after the woodcutter's story, he's like, no, I have to believe that there's some good of humanity. It's not until after the commoner reveals that the woodcutter stole the dagger that he really starts to lose, his faith. And then there's the whole thing with the kid.
Because imagine if the film just left us on just the stories being told and that's it.
Right.
It's okay, well, what we take away from this is that everyone's a liar. No one can be trusted. Rape, murder.
It'd be really bleak. Yeah.
No one really there's no true good people out there anymore. You need this character to kind of speak on that behalf of the audience so that we recognize, hey, we are feeling the same way as this character is. He's calling out the internal turmoil that we have ourselves. The storm manifest as is outside the Rashomon, and then for this baby story to come and kind of does give us hope that yes, there are bad people out there, but there's also, it's not that clear cut. There's no such thing as black and white. There is always going to be some type of nuance,
some shades of gray.
Yeah,
because at the end, like I said, they find or they hear a crying baby. Basically, he's been abandoned in this little fort that they're sheltering under, and I'm assuming he's been there the whole time, just must have been sleeping before that. But the commoner steals everything that was protecting the child. The priest is holding him. They have their little showdown of, everything sucks kind of thing. The commoner leaves, and the woodcutter goes to take the child, and the priest immediately shields him, because the last thing he heard is that this guy held back what could have been the defining story simply because he stole a dagger. Now, as you say, he stole it to feed his family. It's shades of gray, as we said, but he is willing to take in the child. He's like, I've got 6 kids. One more is not going to make that much of a difference. So he's willing to take the child in. It's an interesting way, as you say, to end this film. I will say there was a part of me that as he was, trying to convince the priest to give him the kid, and the priest's thinking over it, I wasn't really sure if I trusted the woodcutter.
Yeah.
When the film ended, I felt more hopeful about it, but as they're in that, I'm just like, we don't know if anything that he says is true.
No, but that's kind of
I mean, I was about to say that the film has basically brought us to the point of, is anything that anybody has said factual?
Yeah. And but there's also another perspective with the taking of the child, where you view it. He's obviously very uncomfortable with the idea of being confronted about the theft of this dagger, and it takes a lot to push him to that point. And while he never really admits to it, it is very strongly implied that yes, he did have something to do with the theft of that dagger, which is probably the reason why he never came upfront about the story, rather than just not wanting to get involved. But what's interesting to also consider with the story is that how much of the idea of like weighing sins as well comes into play, because it comes down to, yes, if we're assuming that he did take the dagger, how much of that admission and um, reconciliation with the guilt of that and the weight of that come into play when it comes time to him to decide to take in this child? Like, what if he hadn't taken?
I was about to say, I think that's a big reason that he chose, because
Exactly.
he's riddled with guilt up to that moment.
Yeah.
And I think that is a big reason why he chose to take the child.
And it also calls into question, like, again, like I said, the whole not being black and white sort of thing. Like, is you can argue, like, is the theft of a dagger, is the theft from a dead person, or I guess, well, you know, I mean, is the theft of the as a result of like a greater crime?
I was about to say, the woman's not dead.
Well, yeah. That's why I corrected myself. Yeah. So is the theft of this dagger truly a crime committed when it basically leads you to saving a child's life? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
does like, would this child essentially would have died if this whole situation hadn't happened? If he hadn't taken the dagger, he may not have been as riddled with grief as he was at that point.
Well, and also, would he have stolen the dagger if he wasn't impoverished with mouths to feed?
Exactly. And again, it also comes into like play. Like, this is what I mean by like the complexity. There's layers and layers and layers. The idea of, you know, again, where this story, the story that they're telling ended with death, it also their story ends with life continuing. On, which is, I guess, leads to another question I want to ask you in terms of your interpretation of the representation of the son in this story.
Representation of the son in what?
I guess to put it differently. So like, you have the story opens up with the rain coming down on the Rashomon. It's pouring down the entire time, trapping them in. Throughout the time in the woods, you see, this is one of the noteworthy things of the cinematography that Kurosawa kind of made popular. The idea of like,
I will say, I love the cinematography in this film. I mean, it's black and white, but it is used in such a stark, beautiful way. The use of light and shadow in this is phenomenal.
And I think the presentation of how the sun is or isn't seen throughout the story is also symbolic of like a lot of the themes that are going on, because, like I said, you have this opening shot in the current, the contemporary of rain coming down. Everything's like muddy, gross, hard to distinguish. You cut back to the trees in the forest in the flashback scenes where you see, like, again, a lot of like worm's eye view shots of like the sun kind of poking through leaves in the trees but not being quite clear. And that's not until this resolution happens with the child being taken in and then like
I said, lots of light and shadow.
But it's when it's when he commits to taking the child as his own and they part ways that the clouds part, the rain stops, and then the sun comes out brightly again at the end of the story. I think there's I think that all that was intentional. And I guess
I mean, honestly, I don't doubt it, but I will say that especially that last bit, I didn't really notice. When you break it down like that, it all makes sense. And I, obviously the rain, I remember the light and shadow. I remember, I did remember that it started, that the rain basically starts to die down as he agrees to take the child. But I didn't really think about the symbolism. That's really cool.
That's something that I would advise, like when it comes to like watching anything Kurosawa, like always pay attention to the weather and how it's presented, because he is very meticulous about like how the weather, whether it be wind, rain, again, a lot of aerial shots like that. Something that I would definitely advise checking out when you're looking at his films. And this is, I think, one of the biggest examples of how well he executes that and coupling it with his story and his themes.
Nice. Yes, I mean, like I said, it didn't jump out at me, but
it's also your first time seeing the film. You're not supposed to get everything.
Really cool. No, I mean, I'm not that observant, that's for sure.
Well, I've got a couple more watches on you, to be fair.
Well, like you said, 10th for you, first for me. So
I think my biggest takeaway from this one, that again, I don't know how I forget it, but I did, in terms of cinematography, was that glorious shot of Mifune when he's recounting his story of like the clouds that are like kind of parted, and you see like the sunshine coming down on him, like that wide field shot of like him on the horseback holding like the sword up as he gallops across the way. It's a gorgeous shot, like, and the fact that that this is a real shot. They actually had the clouds doing
Yeah.
that parting. It's almost like Moses in the Red Sea. The fact that that's real is incredible, and it's an incredible shot. But having watched it this time, it stands out to me almost comedic because it perfectly sets the tone and the style of how the story is going to be told by this type of character. Like he thinks
Right.
he's like this big badass hero type guy, and so of course he's going to come riding into this huge bombastic soundtrack, the sky parting beneath him like to cast light over his horse as he gallops across the field like this great hero.
Right.
It is so indicative of like who this person thinks he is and who he sees himself as, in a way that
Right.
it would not make any sense for the other characters to be introduced similarly. And
Yeah.
I love that. It's probably like maybe one of my favorite shots now in Kurosawa that comes to mind.
That's really cool.
Because again, it has a lot. Like on its own, you just show it to someone who's never seen Rashomon, they're gonna be like, "Oh, wow, it's a great shot. That's gorgeous. I can't believe they got that." But
Right.
if you watch it in the context of the film and the characters, it just adds so many more layers to like what that could actually mean that I think is really fun.
Right. Yeah. That's really cool.
But I mean, that's all I really got to say about the movie, I guess, that comes to mind.
I was about to say, is there anything else that we've missed that we really want to bring up, or
What's okay? Where does this movie stack? Where does the rape scene in this movie stack up for you with other rape scenes in movies in terms of quality?
well, I mean, they don't really show
What's your
that
favorite movie
much.
rape scene?
I've never ranked them. That sounds horrible. Yeah, I mean, it mostly is referred to. The little bit that
Yeah,
we
I couldn't care
see
too much.
is during his story, and it's just the kid. I mean, even that though is uncomfortable. You know, but yeah, it's more implied than
Yeah.
seen.
Well, I think again, like not to sound like I'm a prude or anything like that, but there was. I think we talked about this in the academy with like when we were talking about the divorcee, how there was that
Mhm.
scene, like how like a lot of the sex scenes in that like are explicitly happening, but the way they
Mhm.
showcase it is it's sexual. It's clearly sexual in how it's presented, but it's so pulled back without being gratuitous that it doesn't
Right.
feel like it's overindulgent upon itself.
Right.
I saw like Peter Griffin. It insists upon itself, Lois. No, it's that kind of presentation that I kind of appreciate. Similarly to how the divorcee did a
Mhm.
consensual love scene.
Right. Yeah, I was about to say that one's a little different.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, I haven't really decided how we want to do this. Before we had the flying cow rating system, I don't know if I want to do that for this. I think more I just kind of want to leave with closing thoughts and,
Yeah.
kind of end with whether we think people should see this. I think it's pretty unanimous. We both think people should see this movie.
I have a question for you actually that could maybe
Yeah,
help.
go ahead.
I guess it's a two-parter. So one, are you glad you watched it?
Okay.
And two, are you glad you watched it for the first time at this point in your life versus an earlier point?
Okay. I mean, that's actually interesting. I mean, I'm definitely glad I've seen it. I mean, it's hard to say if I wish. I mean, on one hand, it's like, well, yeah, I do wish I had seen it before. But then if I had seen it before, I wouldn't have been able to talk about it with you on the podcast. I don't know. I think that everything that it is offering me, like, I think the one reason I would say that, oh, I really wish that I had not waited to see this movie is if it was offering me something that would have made certain things in my life make more sense. Like,
Okay.
I would have had a different perspective on certain things had I seen this movie earlier. And partially because so many things have modeled after it, and also because I think the things that those things don't bring up, I've seen in other films or just already agree or, have thought about. So it's not like I feel like I missed something from not having seen it sooner. I'm glad I've seen it now, but I don't feel like I've suffered because I didn't see it earlier. Does that make sense?
I think that the idea of like when you see it, I guess can like work two different, like a couple different ways to your advantage,
Mhm.
depending on like when you're talking about like watching it now. You're obviously going to appreciate it more than you would have like in your teens or like or in your early
Sure.
20s, like where like a lot of the more implied themes are stand to be more at risk of being missed than like
Right.
watching as a more mature human being. Um, versus also I think the advantage of also seeing it at a younger age could be helping contextualize and help you appreciate so many iterations of it that have followed. Like
Mhm.
obviously I'm not going to watch this when I'm like a kid, but if I'd seen the Tiny Toons episode after watching this, I'd be like, oh, it's like that samurai film that I watched.
Right.
Same with the King of the Hill episode. It's like it can help you kind of recontextualize and compare it against things versus it's kind of like when you see like a very very phenomenal film to you, but then you learn that it's basically a ripoff or even just like a crazy pull
Sure.
from a classic that maybe you don't like as much, but
Right.
is still.
Well, I mean, that can also be because there have definitely been films that I've seen that I realize, oh, it was based on this, and I appreciate the original more than, even though I saw the other one first, I
Yeah,
appreciate the original more. But then there's also been things that were the opposite, where there was a version of something that I loved, and I found out, oh, it's heavily based on this. I watched that, and I was like, yeah, it's not as good as the thing that I saw first,
yeah.
you know? So sometimes something is passes the thing that created it, and sometimes there are certain things that will never be surpassed,
Mhm.
so. But yeah. All right, well, if that is it for our discussion here, I want to go ahead and just kind of introduce the film that, well, actually no, let's let people know where to find us, and then we'll get into what is happening next.
Okay.
So you can of course find us on the social medias, Twitter, Instagram, at the Flying Cow Pod, and email at the Flying Cow Pod at gmail.com. We're on Facebook. Feel free to reach out and let us know what you think about the show. Feel free to suggest films. We're not going to think of everything. So if you throw something out, maybe one or both of us haven't seen it, let us know.
Yeah, game on.
Yeah. Anything for you, Jack?
Oh, yeah, I mean, you can follow me on social media at Scoodle. That's my Instagram handle. Beyond that, no, I look for, like I said, I encourage suggestions from all people who are listening in. We love suggestions. I love seeing movies that I haven't seen before, especially if they're good ones,
Yep.
or at least worth talking about.
Absolutely.
So yeah, don't
I
hold
was gonna
back.
say that's half the reason that we're doing this podcast, is so that we can, have an excuse to watch more movies.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because I really like watching things that I haven't seen before, but there are times that I'm just not motivated to
Yeah.
watch something new. But if I've got something like this, that it's like, oh well, you need to, because you got to talk about it, then I'm like, oh, okay. And when I start watching it, I'm like, okay, I get into it.
And that's why it was harder for me to make a call earlier, like, as far as like movies that I would, 3 films I'm going to suggest to you. It's not so much
Right.
that there aren't like plenty that I could think of, but it's I feel like with when it comes to books, TV, music, etc. Everyone's got like that TV show or whatever that you have to watch. If you like
Yeah.
put out, like if I ever want like more than like 10 comments on a Facebook status, I'm just going to ask for a suggestion of a book, TV, movie, etc.
Right.
I feel like when you're looking at it from like a podcast point of view, where you say like, all right, your challenge is to name movies that you want me to see that I haven't seen. What are the best movies I haven't seen? You're going to
Right.
there's going to be much more emphasis, I guess, put on that when you're in a capacity where you're tasked with tasking the other person to do that.
Yeah. Well, and I did a 50 film challenge a few years
Yeah.
ago. You suggested a few films for that for me. And honestly, some of my favorite films I discovered through that. It was great. The one thing that I missed about it, though, was being able to talk have a dialogue
Yeah.
with somebody about it. And I felt like this was kind of the best of both worlds.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean,
in
it's like
that.
I can pass along. The one of us who has seen it can pass along like things they've picked up for multiple watchings or the
Mhm.
cultural impact that they've gathered, and the other person can kind of help the other person like kind of like get the um almost like vicariously like relive the experience of seeing it again for the first time, which is obviously a treasure most people look to when it comes to watching films and TV shows.
Yep.
So
Well, speaking of, it is time for me to announce the film that I have picked for us for next time. It is a film that I know Jack has not seen because we have discussed it.
Meet Dave.
And no, no. I will say though, we talked about the fact that not only would we be suggesting, good films, but also films that maybe we know aren't so good, but we
Like Meet Dave.
either enjoy them from a certain perspective or we at least think it'll make an interesting conversation. So there is
Yeah.
a film that I grew up watching, and I know objectively that it is not a good movie. Like 75% of this movie does not work, but there are parts of this movie that make me die laughing. And I have quoted parts of this movie since seeing it for the first time. So next episode, we will be talking about the Tom Arnold starring classic, The Stupids.
All right. Hell yeah. I feel less bad about Freddy Got Fingered now.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned this to you before.
Okay.
It is it's from 1996, and like I said, it stars Tom Arnold, so that should let you know what you're in for.
Cool. Let's go. I'm here for it.
But it also has Christopher Lee
Okay. Oh,
and
sold.
um
Can't be worse than Captain America.
Bob Keesham, Captain Kangaroo, plays a role in the film.
All right.
It's a very interesting film, and I can't wait to talk to you about it.
All right. I'm excited.
Yeah. All right. You started out. I was like, Jack is gonna throw some off the wall crap at me. So
Oh yeah.
I gotta start things off. I
No,
gotta
I'm
start
Googling
things
another
off
now.
by throwing a curveball at you. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a great one lined up for us in the coming episode.
Oh, fun.
All
Okay.
right.
All
Yeah.
right. Well, that will be next time. And so yeah, we'll be excited to talk about that. But until that time, moo.
Oink.
Mm.